3:17 p.m. local time. Southern Caribbean Sea, clear skies, calm water, and visibility stretching as far as the horizon. From the flight deck of the U.S. aircraft carrier, everything looked ordinary. The sea was flat, the air was steady, and routine flight operations were moving exactly as planned. Inside the carrier's operations spaces, radar teams were monitoring the usual picture: commercial traffic, weather activity, and friendly escort ships holding position around the carrier strike group. Then the surface picture changed. 8 new contacts appeared on the screens almost at the same time. They were not scattered across the sea. They were not moving randomly. 8 surface vessels had emerged from different directions, all shifting toward one point: the carrier. At first, they looked like standard regional patrol vessels, but at sea, patterns often reveal more than appearances. And this pattern was not normal. Within seconds of being detected, each contact increased speed. Their movements changed almost together. Headings adjusted with precision. These were not separate ships on unrelated routes. This was coordinated. The watch officer reported it at once. Multiple surface contacts. New group bearing 300 through 045. Range closing. The room became quiet. On the main display, the 8 Venezuelan naval vessels began forming a wide arc. First they spread out, then slowly tightened. 2 moved toward the carrier's port quarter, 3 shifted toward starboard. The remaining ships stayed slightly behind, creating depth and flexibility. It was a pressure formation designed to reduce maneuvering room without crossing into open confrontation. No systems were used, no targeting locks were detected. But intent does not always need a dramatic signal. The carrier strike group was operating lawfully in international waters, and that mattered. Every choice made from that moment forward would be viewed through more than a tactical lens. It would also carry political, legal, and strategic weight. Bridge-to-bridge calls went out. This is a United States Navy vessel conducting lawful transit in international waters. State your intentions. No answer. A second call followed, this time in both English and Spanish. Still nothing. That silence was not empty. In maritime encounters, silence can be a message of its own. It pushes the other side to make the first visible move, to raise the temperature, to create the official record. And the U.S. Navy does not rush that step. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, operators began building a complete profile. Hull types, radar emissions, speed changes, formation shape. Every detail was logged, every second was recorded. The carrier did not change course. That decision was intentional. Turning away could be read as avoidance. Holding course showed confidence, discipline, and legal clarity. Around the carrier, the escorts tightened their screen. Guided missile destroyers and cruisers shifted with controlled precision, adjusting by degrees and knots rather than dramatic turns. This was not theater, it was control. As the Venezuelan vessels moved closer, their formation became sharper. One ship edged ahead, quietly taking the lead position. Another moved wider than expected, testing the outer edge of the carrier group's defensive space. Still, there were no radio responses, no direct signals, no sudden moves, but the distance was closing. Below deck, air crew were placed on alert. In the hangar areas, teams prepared calmly and quietly. No rushing, no shouting, just checklists, training, and muscle memory. Above them, the carrier's radar continued to track the surface picture with cold precision. 8 vessels, 8 hulls, 8 decisions still waiting to be made. This was not an engagement. Not yet, but it was no longer routine. The Venezuelan vessels were now close enough that their intent could no longer be dismissed as routine movement. Still, the carrier held its course. In situations like this, control does not always come from speed or noise. Sometimes it comes from patience. The side that controls the tempo often controls the outcome. And now, the clock was running. By 3:24 p.m., the distance had become impossible to ignore. The nearest Venezuelan ship had crossed into a zone every surface officer recognizes immediately. This was no longer a distant contact on a screen. This was close interaction range. At that distance, intent is not measured by words. It is measured by movement, timing, and the choices a ship makes or refuses to make. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical picture was now clear. Surface tracks were steady, bearings were confirmed, speed and course data had been locked in. All 8 contacts were moving with purpose, adjusting in relation to the carrier's unchanged path. And still, the carrier did not turn. That was not hesitation. It was procedure. The carrier strike group was operating under full legal authority, international waters, lawful movement, no direct action taken against it, and no clear hostile declaration from the other side. That framework mattered. Every response from the U.S. side had to remain clean, controlled, and unmistakably within the rules. The watch team moved into the next phase. Every maneuver was logged. Every course change was time-stamped. Electronic monitoring systems began collecting more detail, not in an aggressive way, but with focused attention. Sensors listened, recorded, and classified what they detected. Every radar signal coming from the Venezuelan ships was captured and studied. Search patterns, power levels, sweep behavior. Nothing showed a direct targeting posture, but the situation was changing. On the bridge, the captain remained steady. Calm posture, controlled voice, eyes forward. A third radio call was sent. This is a United States Navy vessel. You are approaching at an unsafe distance. State your intentions. Again, there was no reply, but silence at sea is rarely empty. It can be full of calculation. The Venezuelan formation tightened further. Two ships moved closer to each other, narrowing their spacing. Another reduced speed slightly, creating more depth behind the lead elements. This was not random movement. It was controlled positioning, designed to apply pressure while staying just short of a clear legal line. The escort ships responded almost without being noticed. A destroyer on the carrier's port side adjusted course by 2 degrees. A cruiser on the starboard side increased speed by half a knot. Small moves, precise moves, the kind of geometry that quietly restores balance to a defensive screen while keeping the overall appearance of normal transit. No alarms sounded, none were needed. On the flight deck, aircraft remained parked. Catapults stayed still. From above, the carrier looked unchanged, but below deck, readiness had increased. Pilots were briefed. Helicopter crews moved closer to their aircraft. Checklists were reviewed carefully without rushing, because rushing is where mistakes begin. At 3:31 p.m., one Venezuelan ship shifted into a stronger radar mode. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The electronic warfare officer reported it quietly. Contact Sierra lead is painting. Surface search, elevated power. That single detail changed the atmosphere in the room. It was still not a direct hostile act, but it was attention. Focused attention. And that meant the carrier strike group was no longer simply being observed. It was being assessed. The response stayed measured. The carrier did not activate unnecessary systems. It did not signal a direct challenge. It did not make a dramatic move. Instead, it prepared. A Seahawk helicopter was placed on immediate standby. Rotors still, crew seated, systems live. In that moment, the aircraft was not being used to threaten. It was being used to create visibility, proof. A witness in the air, able to see what radar could not and record every detail from above. The Venezuelan vessels kept closing in. The closest point of approach was now being calculated in minutes, not miles. Everyone involved understood the balance being held. Respond too softly and the pressure could increase. Respond too strongly and the official record could shift against you. This was the narrow space where modern naval standoffs exist between restraint and resolve. No one raised their voice. No one rushed the next decision. Because in moments like this, one rule matters more than anything else. Never give the other side the moment they are waiting for. And at 3:35 p.m., the situation was about to change without a single direct clash. At 3:36 p.m., the encounter reached its quiet turning point. No alarm sounded, no orders were shouted. But across the carrier strike group, the posture changed together. Not toward confrontation, but toward clarity. The decision was made. Launch the helicopter. On the flight deck, the Seahawk crew moved with practiced precision. The rotor blades began turning slowly at first, then faster, slicing through the humid Caribbean air. Deck crew gave their signals. Securing chains were removed. The helicopter lifted smoothly from the deck, moved forward low and steady, cleared the carrier's bow, and leveled off. This was not escalation. It was documentation. From the moment the Seahawk entered the air, the entire dynamic shifted. The helicopter stayed within international rules, maintaining a safe altitude and speed. Its sensors were active, but its posture remained controlled. Infrared cameras came online. High-resolution optics focused on the lead Venezuelan vessel. For the first time, there were eyes directly on the bridge. Back inside the Combat Information Center, the live video feed appeared on a secondary display. Every movement aboard the Venezuelan ship could now be seen in real time. Crew positions, bridge activity, body language. Nothing dramatic, but nothing hidden either. The Seahawk made a wide, deliberate pass. Not overhead, not as a challenge, just close enough to make the message impossible to miss. A green visual marker flashed briefly across the bridge windows of the Venezuelan vessel. Non-damaging, brief, and unmistakable. Then came the radio call. Venezuelan naval vessel, this is a United States Navy helicopter. You are operating at an unsafe distance in international waters. Your actions are being recorded. The message was repeated in Spanish. This time, the silence ended. A response came back over the radio, cautious and controlled, much slower than the movements that had brought them there. United States naval aircraft. This is Venezuelan patrol vessel conducting routine operations. It was not an apology. It was not a withdrawal. But it was communication, and that mattered. The helicopter held position in a stable orbit. Cameras stayed focused. The visual marker remained off. The message had been delivered. Now came the waiting. On the surface, the 8 Venezuelan vessels began to lose their symmetry. The lead ship reduced speed slightly. Another adjusted course by only a few degrees, barely noticeable unless every vector was being tracked precisely. The formation was no longer tightening, it was hesitating. Inside the carrier, no one celebrated. No one relaxed. This phase was the most delicate, not because a direct clash was certain, but because uncertainty is dangerous on its own. At this distance, a misunderstanding can turn restraint into reaction faster than anyone intends. The escorts held their positions. No new dramatic movements, no unnecessary signals. The carrier continued on its original heading. That was the point. By remaining steady, the strike group placed the next decision back on the Venezuelan commanders. Move closer, and the record would show it. Ease away, and the pressure could fade without either side needing to say it out loud. The Seahawk began a second, wider orbit. The balance had changed, not through force, but through visibility. Every second of the helicopter's footage was time-stamped, geolocated, and logged. This was no longer only a tense encounter at sea, it had become a record, and a clear record can carry influence far beyond the horizon. At 3:44 p.m., the lead Venezuelan vessel adjusted course. The move was small, but decisive. Its wake shifted. Its speed dropped below 20 knots. Then, one by one, the others began to follow. The Seahawk remained in the air, watching and recording, but never pushing closer than necessary. The message had been delivered. More importantly, it had been understood. There was no dramatic announcement, no major warning, no public statement waiting to be written. But in that quiet change of direction, the outcome was already clear. In modern naval encounters, the side that controls the record does not need to raise the pressure. And now, the record was firmly in American hands. By 3:47 p.m., the pressure had fully shifted. The Venezuelan formation no longer looked like an intercept pattern. What had started as 8 coordinated vessels pressing inward had turned into a staggered line. Their speeds were uneven. Their headings were no longer matched. The difference was subtle, but to anyone trained to read movement at sea, it was unmistakable. Inside the Combat Information Center, the report came calmly. Surface group is disengaging. Multiple course changes observed. No one needed confirmation. The data said enough. The lead Venezuelan ship reduced speed again. Its bow moved several degrees away from the carrier's projected path. It was not a sharp turn. It was not a public retreat. It was just enough to break the geometry that had been applying pressure. The other vessels followed in sequence. This was not confusion. It was a decision. The Seahawk stayed on station, holding a wide orbit that showed observation, not pursuit. Its cameras continued recording, capturing the exact moment when pressure gave way to restraint. On the Venezuelan deck, crew members could be seen moving back from exposed positions. One sailor raised an arm in a gesture that was hard to define. Not defiant, not submissive. At sea, gestures can carry many meanings. This one was simple enough. We see you. This is over. On the carrier's bridge, nothing changed. No course correction, no speed adjustment. The ship continued forward through the calm water as if the entire encounter had never interrupted its transit. That steadiness mattered. Any visible reaction could have been misread as celebration or provocation. The U.S. Navy avoided both. At 3:52 p.m., the Venezuelan vessels began opening lateral distance. The tightening arc became a widening fan. One ship moved south, another dropped behind, allowing the gap to grow without any announcement. Radio traffic stayed minimal. This is a United States Navy vessel. We acknowledge your maneuver. Maintain safe distance. No reply came back. None was needed. The Seahawk completed its final orbit and turned back toward the carrier. It did not follow the departing vessels. It did not remain overhead longer than necessary. It climbed smoothly to transit altitude and headed home. Its mission was complete. One by one, sensors were powered down. Footage was secured. The record was archived. From the flight deck, the recovery looked routine. Chains were attached. Rotors slowed. Sailors returned to their work without ceremony. For them, this was not a victory moment. It was doctrine carried out correctly. Below deck, analysts reviewed the encounter frame by frame. Timelines were assembled. Movements were mapped. Every second of the approach, the standoff, and the withdrawal was logged with precision. This is the part most people never see. The moment when tension becomes documentation. And documentation matters. Hours or days later, when official statements appear and competing versions of events begin to form, the footage would remain steady and unemotional. It would show who moved closer, who stayed silent, who changed course first. In modern maritime operations, the clearest advantage is often not speed, size, or noise. It is proof. By 4:05 p.m., the Venezuelan vessels were well outside any unsafe distance. They were still visible on radar, still present in the wider area, but they no longer shaped the encounter. The carrier strike group returned to its normal rhythm. Watches rotated, aircraft were serviced. The sea returned to its quiet, misleading calm. To someone watching from shore, it might have seemed like nothing serious had happened. No dramatic scene, no live broadcast, just ships moving across open water. But beneath that calm, the reality was different. 8 naval vessels had moved deliberately toward a U.S. aircraft carrier. They had applied pressure with coordination, silence, and timing. And they had stepped away not because the situation spiraled, but because the balance of control never left American hands. This was not about dominance, it was about discipline. At sea, the side that loses composure loses leverage. And that afternoon in the Caribbean, composure never broke. The encounter ended the way many of the most serious ones do, not with spectacle, but with distance slowly opening, the water widening between them, and a quiet understanding that needed no further words. The sea does not hold on to tension, but the records do. By the time the sun began dropping toward the western horizon, the encounter was already finished. No public statements had been released, no official announcements had been made, no alerts had moved beyond the operational chain. On the surface, it looked like another routine transit through international waters. But inside the carrier strike group, the meaning of what had happened was already being examined. In the carrier's command spaces, analysts reviewed the timeline quietly. Every maneuver, every moment of radio silence, every small change in course, every shift in speed. The data told a clear story. It did not need drama, it did not need exaggeration. This was a textbook example of pressure without open escalation and control without the need for force. The 8 Venezuelan naval vessels had approached with purpose. Their formation, their speed changes, and their silence were deliberate. This was not a simple navigation issue. It was a calculated test, meant to measure response, posture, and political will. But what they met was not panic. It was not overreaction. It was discipline. The carrier never changed course. The strike group never broke its formation. No unnecessary challenge was made. No dramatic signal was sent. Every move by the U.S. Navy stayed firmly within international law and established rules of engagement. That mattered, because legality creates leverage long after the ships move apart. The helicopter launch changed the situation completely, not by intimidation, but by clarity. Once the encounter was being recorded, once every movement became visible and undeniable, the burden shifted. From that moment forward, every additional mile closed, and every extra knot of speed would become part of the Venezuelan side of the record. And they understood that. Their withdrawal was measured, controlled, and quiet. Not because they had no options, but because pushing further no longer served the purpose. Once they lost control of the narrative, the encounter stopped working in their favor. That is the reality of modern naval confrontation. Power is no longer measured only by size, speed, or advanced systems. It is also measured by restraint, documentation, and the ability to remain calm while every action is being watched. That is why aircraft carriers do not rush. That is why destroyers adjust by degrees, not by spectacle. That is why silence at sea can speak louder than any broadcast. Nothing about this encounter required a dramatic clash. In fact, that would have weakened the carrier strike group's position. The absence of open confrontation was not hesitation. It was confidence. Because when a ship holds its position legally, visibly, and deliberately, it forces the other side to make the next choice. Continue the pressure and own the record. Step back and let the moment fade. Most of the time, when the situation becomes that clear, the second option comes quietly. In the days that followed, the footage would be archived, reports would be filed. The data would be added to broader assessments of regional behavior. No single encounter defines an entire strategy, but every encounter adds weight. And this one reinforced a familiar lesson. Professional restraint does not show weakness. It reveals who was testing the line in the first place. For the sailors involved, there were no celebrations, no headlines on the flight deck, no victory moment. Watches changed, aircraft were serviced, operations continued. That is the nature of naval service. Success is often measured by what never happens. No collision, no miscalculation, no uncontrolled escalation. Just 8 ships turning away from a carrier that never had to flinch. So the question remains, not for the crews who lived it, but for everyone watching from a distance. In a time of rising tension and smaller margins for error, should pressure at sea be answered with force or with patience? Should navies respond more aggressively when challenged? Or is discipline still the strongest tool on the water? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real-world maritime encounters like this, where quiet decisions matter, minutes can change everything, and professionalism shapes the outcome, Make sure you are subscribed.